Fantasy Flight Games. They made all of these games, many of which are still my favorite games today. But now when I look at their website, it's not much. So they went from this in Gen Con 2011 to now, 14 years later, no new games announced at Gen Con? Okay, they did announce an expansion for TI4 on the 31st of July. That's awesome, but that's also not a new game. So I'm sure many of you will resonate with the question, what happened to FFG? What happened to FFG? What happened to FFG? There was Battlestar Galactica, Twilight Imperium, all the Arkham Files games, Chaos in the Old World, Android Netrunner. It felt like Fantasy Flight had so many good games across genres, and it's pretty safe to say that if you were seriously in the hobby for a while, you have played many of their games at least once. So what happened? It felt like their yearly updates of in-flight reports always had the new and exciting thing. What happened to my favorite designers that worked at FFG? What happened to all of their IPs? How did FFG rise and fall across more than 25 years of board game history? From the Wild West of the early 2000s to where the industry is now, where it's knee-deep in online crowdfunding. Now, before we dive in, I just want to say that I don't know everything. I just don't know everything that happened. I don't know what happened behind the scenes at FFG besides some interviews I've read, and I wasn't in the industry for a lot of FFG's history, especially for their glory days. I don't have any information besides what you can research online, and I scoured a ton of different articles, podcasts, and videos for this, then combining it with my own board game knowledge. So this video obviously will have a leaning towards games and IPs I've personally experienced, as there's countless FFG games and role-playing systems I just haven't experienced. I'm also trying to lean more into analysis rather than having a strict timeline of things, so as we go through the rise and fall sections, things won't necessarily be chronological. And then as always, my final thoughts on FFG and then the whole board game industry will be at the end. So now let's rewind 30 years. Fantasy Flight Games is older than me. It was founded in 1995 as a comic book publisher called Fantasy Flight Publishing by a man called Christian T. Peterson. It was known for importing European comics. Now, this guy is very important to our story as he single-handedly designed, published, and assembled their first game in 1997 called Twilight Imperium. Now, Fantasy Flight Publishing was known as Fantasy Flight Games. Twilight Imperium retailed for $45, which was considered very expensive at the time for a board game. This is about $90 today. It did very well, selling out in under 2 days at the Origins Game Fair, which allegedly saved the company since no one was buying the imported European comics in America. But FFG was mostly made up of book products. From 2000 to 2008, they produced a series of supplements and adventures for D&D 3rd edition under an open gaming license called Layers and Legends, which I've never played, much less heard of before this video. It's here I want to introduce two more characters central to the FFG story, who are also game designers. One is Kevin Wilson, who started out making these role-playing booklets for Layer and Legends, then collaborated with Peterson in 2003 to make the Game of Thrones board game. The other is Corey Koneska. How do you say this name? Okay, awesome that he explains the pronunciation in an AMA. Koneska. I'll refer to him as Corey K from now on, okay? He started working at FFG in 2005 and started out just designing bosses and equipment for their World of Warcraft, the board game. So within the first 10 years of Fantasy Flight Games, also known as Fantasy Flight Publishing, they're doing book products and some games here and there, like StarCraft, Warrior Knights, Runebound, Fear of Dracula, Arkham Horror, and even 3 editions of Twilight Imperium. 3rd edition released in 2004. Their games were mostly big box and very thematic, which brings us to... how did Fantasy Flight Games become so successful? When we look back, they have so many well-regarded games in the community. How were they able to keep their success up? Well, when I look back with our hindsight, I'm gonna say they had 5 major advantages. 1, amazing components. I remember all their cardboard being known for quite high quality, and yeah, I felt so myself. Stuff from Eldritch Horror and TI4 still holds up today after so many hours of gameplay, and they always feel good. FFG would also often include miniatures in their games when that just wasn't commonplace in a board game. You would go to a miniatures game for minis. Like by comparison, Euros would give wooden cubes or meeples. Number 2, popular IP leveraged really well. They were able to have the Blizzard license for the StarCraft and World of Warcraft board games. There was Lord of the Rings. They got Game of Thrones before it was even a TV show and more popular in the mainstream. Fantasy Flight would also push for big brands like Warhammer, where they signed in 2008 for Warhammer and 40K with Games Workshop. They also had countless others. The list goes on and on. Number 3, art. Their art was incredible and leveraged well. It was all over the game box to really hook your attention at the store. Then cards would be chock full of art, And boards would look nice, not like drab Euro boards, and when you played a character, you really felt like that was the character you were playing. Number 4, they're good at pushing thematic asymmetry. Maybe it's because of FFG's role-playing background, but they had so many games where you got to play as a faction or a character to really add to the experience. Like Arkham Horror, where you got to play as a specific investigator with different items and money. Or Battlestar Galactica, you got to play as your favorite character from the show with their once per game abilities. Or Chaos in the Old World, where you got to control a literal Warhammer evil god to cause destruction to the land. So advantage number 5 is that FFG was really willing to push the envelope on design. Now this is very subjective, but let's go. So you might have thought that Dominion was the first deck building game released in 2008, but actually deck building was allegedly done first in the StarCraft board game in 2007. I say allegedly because I haven't played this board game though. The Game of Thrones board game made fantasy area control have deterministic combat with asymmetric cards per house. Then you could backstab with command tokens. Peterson took the mega backstabbing idea from Diplomacy the board game and now put a lot more ingredients around it. Or how about how Corey K would go through every single episode of BSG and write down every bad thing that happened to the crew to make the crisis cards. Or going through every single Star Wars movie for Star Wars Rebellion, scene by scene to find out what to create. This doesn't sound that mind-blowing today, but remember, this is from an era where thematic IP in board game usually meant something like Harry Potter Trivia Pursuit. And then we have the infamous Android, where it felt like Kevin Wilson was trying to put so many mechanics in a single game. It didn't really work out, but they're trying. So there's mystery deduction with incredible asymmetry, a bajillion components, and an Illuminati mini puzzle you had to do. So again, my memory is saying this didn't work very coherently, but it's definitely very interesting and you can see they're trying. And then there was also the LCG and app integration stuff, which we'll get into later. And FFG were able to exploit these advantages because, well, they didn't really have any competitors for a while. So in its early days, there were 2 main competitors it had in the hobby board game space, Mayfair and Rio Grande. These companies were both pushing Euros, and by that, I mean generally the more drab looking ones. You might know Mayfair from Agricola, Tigris and Euphrates, and of course, Catan. Rio Grande had Power Grid, Dominion, and Carcassonne. Then for other thematic big box games, sure, there was Flying Frog Productions, Games Workshop, and Ares Games. Ares Games didn't have too many games as they were kind of late to the party, being founded in 2011. They had a gem with War of the Ring, which was first produced by a small publisher called Nexus Edgetris. These guys are just so small that they're not a competitor. Games Workshop had the beloved Horus Heresy, but actually were using board games as more of a means to funnel people into their miniatures games, where they could get crazy profit by selling minis to whales. Essentially, Board Game Geek users is not what Games Workshop ever targeted. And think about how Games Workshop outsourced their game design to FFG at some point. Flying Frog Productions is the easiest to talk about with their Last Light on Earth and Fortune and Glory. These were just tons of dice-chucking Ameritrash games that were all about a campy story. These thematic big box games had their fans, but they're never doing as much as FFG in production quantity ever. But what about the old giant, Avalon Hill? Well, wargaming was actually on the decline from the 70s to the 80s. And the owner of Avalon Hill just quickly sold it to Hasbro in 1998 to just get out of the games business. Hasbro also owns Wizards of the Coast, so we'll talk about these companies all 3 together here. And, well, they really didn't do anything for board gaming during FFG's early days. There weren't really any new war games that came out besides Axis and Allies, which is a really long game, and from playing 2 versions of it, they just kind of use the same systems again and again on different maps. Then there was also the old classic Diplomacy, which they didn't modify at all. As for more dedicated board games, there was the Old Acquire from 1999, and then Nexus Op and Old Cosmic Encounter. Not many games here, right? I could only find 2 games under the Hasbro umbrella that seemed to be actual competitors to the thematically asymmetric, not so long games FFG was doing. One is Betrayal at House on the Hill, which had the innovative haunts. This is still being played today with 3rd edition. Then there were the D&D Adventure System board games that were based on D&D 4th edition, and featured full co-op without a Dungeon Master, so this was definitely a competitor to FFG's Dungeon Crawler line. But maybe it was a little late to the party coming 5 years after Descent 1st edition? I can't imagine it was taking away Descent's serious fans. Rather, these D&D board games were better at getting fans of 4th edition to play a board game. Speaking of these other publishers that were competitors, here are some other points I thought that were unique to FFG. Now, I'm not sure if these points are advantages or not, so Let's just get into them because they are unique to FFG. Number 1, expansion support. You knew that FFG would likely keep supporting a game after you bought it, meaning that even if the game wasn't that good on release, it would get fixed later. So you might just buy it now to enjoy it if you like the premise. This is really reducing the upfront risk of buying a dud game, and for some, there might be this excitement of getting into the system first before FFG made changes too. There's also a certain thrill the more hardcore crowd would get from mixing and matching modules to try to find the perfect way to play the game. It also meant that there could be an incredible amount of replayability in the future for a game. So if the game was for an IP you liked, but you didn't see the characters or story bits you liked yet, they could very likely come up in the future. Like think of Eldritch Horror, where you really wanted to go to the Mountains of Madness, but that story wasn't in the base game. So now you just had to wait, and then when it comes out, getting all that new content ready to play isn't that expensive or hard to do if you already had the base game. And then just think of all the BSG expansions. So much support for every season of the show. Like even before I was in the industry, I would always hear the phrase, oh yeah, it's FFG, so they'll come out with an expansion. The expansions definitely created loyal fans who were rewarded by keeping up with what FFG was doing, as that could mean more content for their favorite games. Uniqueness number 2, developing their own IPs in-house. This actually piggybacks off of the expansion support idea, where you knew that if it was a Fantasy Flight IP, they want to keep releasing product to expand the world. You can see in Twilight Imperium, there's an insane amount of lore for the game included in the box. We can really see this in the Arkham Files. They made so many games with a very similar premise and pretty much the same investigators, so I'm sure they saved a lot of money off of art there. Or the Android world. There were a lot of Android books. The Android board game was a huge sprawling world that was the world of Android Netrunner. I actually read one of these Android books called Freefall and quite enjoyed it, and it gave me more motivation to play more Android Netrunner. And I also probably bought Android off of that enjoyment of Freefall. I mean, I had to experience their elevator called the Beanstalk in a game. Uniqueness number 3, video content. This one really jumped out to me specifically, you could probably guess why. But by watching their content on YouTube, it really made me feel more like a fan, and then I could feel that they love to support their games. There were very well produced tutorials so you can learn their game without reading the rulebook, or you could send it to a friend. And then they were definitely one of the first to do board game trailers. Remember, this is way before Kickstarter, so the idea of a trailer for a board game was shockingly new. Remember, we're talking about at least a decade ago. And I liked watching the Gen Con vlogs, which had good production value for the time, and they were just great energy. As a teenager, it was thrilling to watch this event in Indiana unfold, where new releases were constantly being announced. The last uniqueness is that the overall vibe contributed to more storytelling in their games. And it's really trying to merge Ameritrash and Euro together, or you have a Amerithrash. So something very FFG feeling is that your specific character goes to an interesting location and that interacts with some type of item they're carrying in some way. And then some specific enemy just arrives to interact with that to make it absurd. Like Kevin Wilson named a great example of an Arkham Horror, Ashcan Pete, who is a drifter, was thrown out of the library for having an overdue book find. And then he was just set upon a flying pull-up that had been lurking in the sky. So Corey K, who designed BSG, which is filled with memorable silent betrayals and nukes flying around and civilians dying, so he said that, I want to design games that people will tell stories about for years. A good game is more than the sum of its parts. It isn't mechanics, it isn't numbers, it is social experience. And then we have another quote from Christian T. Peterson, the designer of Twilight Imperium and the CEO of FFG for a long time. He said that he doesn't want too much beard stroking in his games. Rather, he wants moments that cause good narrative. He wants people to jump up in glee during moments of the game. FFG just had a really good feel for the genre of a game with a lot of different games. Like horror was their Arkham Files, sci-fi and space opera was Twilight Imperium or Android. Here's a great quote from a podcast I heard.
And if you loved fantasy and you loved all that wizards and goblins and magic and stuff the way I am officially on the record as loving it, then you love their game set in their Tyranoth world. And the Tyranoth world is kind of famously generic, and nobody really could tell you anything about the lore of the place other than the most hardcore fans. It's basically like everybody you took Middle Earth and Azeroth and like Narnia and Shannara and every fantasy world that's ever been, and you put it in a bag and shook it up, and out would pop Tyranoth. Here it is. It's all the things you love.
Before moving on, we're gonna have this micro section about cool innovations FFG has done that's caught my eye, and these will matter in later parts of the video too. The LCG, the living card game. This was FFG's big idea to have the feeling of a trading card game like Magic the Gathering, but not force players to buy booster packs. Rather, you'd be guaranteed cards when you bought expansion boxes, and even the core set had a ton of decks, included for a normal board game price. This started with the Game of Thrones the card game and really saw success with Android Netrunner, and even today we have Arkham Horror LCG and Marvel Champions going strong. Now FFG had a lot of LCGs, but when they were going well, I'm sure they made a lot of money and probably helped fund tons of other projects. But sustained community presence was always kind of hit or miss, and we'll have an entire section on the LCG later. Piggybacking off the LCG innovation was Keyforge, where they procedurally generated decks, as every deck you buy is a completely unique combo of cards. Talk about unique approach, where typically for card games, everyone had the same boring starter deck at first. Then we had app integration. FFG was really pushing for new ways to play their games, and this was really felt by us for Descent 2nd Edition in 2016, when they allowed you to play this some versus all game that needed a sort of game master, and now you could play completely cooperative, and the app would manage a lot of the game. This was actually really well executed, and it breathed way more life into the game. And so this is a way to really please your fans. Just give them extra content for free. There's also Mansions of Madness 2nd Edition, which was also very app driven, letting the game hide lots of story elements within the app. And there was even awesome dialogue trees from NPCs to feel like a immersive world. In FFG's waning days, they even came out with Descent Legends of the Dark or Descent 3rd Edition, which I still have but never played, and that was even more app integration for a dungeon crawler, but again, more on that later. At some point in time around the early 2010s, FFG was riding really high. Their website was so frequently updated that it felt like there were multiple updates a week, if not sometimes in a day. And it was easy to see why they're doing so well with a massive catalog of games that appealed to pretty much every single serious hobbyist board gamer. If you wanted an epic confrontational game night for two, there was Star Wars Rebellion, Tides of Iron, or Battlelore. If you wanted a competitive 1v1 that was still intense, but you could evolve with the game as more cards came out, there was Android Netrunner or later Keyforge. If you wanted cooperative card gaming, there was the LCG line with Lord of the Rings or Arkham Horror. If you wanted social deduction, there was Battlestar Galactica with its 3 expansions. You choose which ones you want to use, more profits for FFG. If you wanted an immersive horror Lovecraft time, there was a relatively medium length with Eldritch Horror, to longer length with Arkham Horror, and then a bajillion expansions for each. If you wanted a campaign game with friends, there was the Fantasy Descent, or even Lord of the Rings, or there was Fallout, or Doom, or Star Wars Imperial Assault. If you wanted a 6P Game of Thrones style backstabbing, there was literally Game of Thrones 2nd Edition. Or of course there was Twilight Imperium 3rd Edition with expansions that was still super popular even though it was released in 2003. Or you could play Rex Final Days of an Empire, which I've only played this once, so I can't really speak to how good it is. If you wanted a silly party game experience, they had Citadels, and they even brought back Cosmic Encounter. People love this game. Or if you wanted these 5 euros, like Tigris and Euphrates, you could buy them from their Euro Classics line. Or you could play Blue Moon, which I haven't played, but that was popular. Heck, if you wanted role-playing to supplement your board gaming, they had these new role-playing systems coming out. Basically, you could have someone just stay within the Fantasy Flight ecosystem and just keep buying their new releases as it breathed life into their old games, especially if it was an IP they really liked, such as Star Wars. Maybe the games weren't the most elegant, there was a lot of rules and components, but you had a safe bet that the components and art were good, and that they were trying to tell a story. Allegedly, their Gen Con booth was ultra packed, where in 2011, people were reporting there were tons of lines for all the FFG goodies, and the FFG booth was like a game store in of itself. So you could buy FFG game, look at the catalog it comes with, then continue to buy more FFG. I mean, that was kind of me. FFG just created these conditions to create these die-hard fans, and I want to read this really funny quote I found online. I realized recently when filling out the paperwork for a third mortgage on my home to buy some Fantasy Flight games, I should receive the payment in time for the next 15 games this month, and my kidneys should be sold in time for February, that licenses are overrated. I don't really want a game based off of Dune or on Warcraft, I just want a game with 2 Fs on the cover. Oh, also there was this movie made by FFG which I thought was hilarious that this exists. And then after looking at screenshots, I decided against watching it, but anyone let me know if they did end up watching this one? The Fall. Okay, this section is much harder to talk about than The Rise because I just don't know everything. But I have a couple of interesting reasons on why FFG might not be doing so well and falling off. Some of these I just found online and expanded upon them. Others I came up on my own. And it certainly isn't just one thing that is the reason for their downfall, okay? So let's get into the many reasons. Number 1 is Star Wars X-Wing. Yes, one singular game. This has been claimed by many to be the beginning of the end for FFG because it was just too successful. So Star Wars X-Wing was everything that FFG was good at, just put into one accessible package. It had an IP that people really liked, it had nice art and presentation with very captivating miniatures, it had thematic asymmetry to pick your ship and pilot, and the way it tackled miniature movement with now moving ships was unique. And it had ridiculous amounts of replayability with the ridiculous amounts of expansions, which meant tons of money for FFG as people bought in. So it was too successful because it probably hurt Games Workshop miniature sales. So maybe Games Workshop wanted to cut ties with FFG because of this in 2016. And so FFG lost the rights to produce all of these Warhammer holdings, like Chaos in the Old World specifically in 2017. The other part of this is that X-Wing showed higher up management that, hey, why don't we just make more games like X-Wing, because this is just printing money. Why invest in so much R&D and bigger shipments for big box games when we have no idea if they'll succeed, when we could just make more X-Wing? Or perhaps let's just make another LCG. This is really seen today in FFG's main offerings being Arkham Horror LCG and Marvel Champions LCG. So now we're talking more on money. And so there's this theory that FFG was always a financially unsteady company. There was just way too many creative projects going on at once. I mean, they were announcing things constantly, right? Peterson said himself that the company was teetering on the edge of collapse multiple times, and that the D20 role-playing system has saved them. The D20 role-playing system is what I assume are just games that are D&D clones that I found on this list. There's quite a bit of them. But yeah, FFG had some big releases that just tanked, like Legends of the Five Rings LCG, which had a very short lifespan of 4 years for a LCG. There was just so much hype put into the world building and then it was gone. Or Star Wars Destiny. It died by completely underestimating demand on launch, destroying credibility in it, and so by the time they could get logistics together to supply the game to people, the interest already died. Perhaps upper management never gave the full support to these projects that they needed to succeed, where maybe later they could become a Arkham Horror or Eldritch Horror. So this angle believes that FFG just really wanted to cut their losses as soon as they realized that a game wasn't going to succeed because it just wasn't a safe cash cow. They're really limiting their upside with this massive risk aversion. Let's talk management. It was never good, supposedly, from what I've heard. Now, of course, management is really hard to quantify. I made a Glassdoor account just to snoop around, and it doesn't look good for FFG. And it could be just people disappointed that their dream job of board game required hard work. It's hard to tell, but the fact is that people were disgruntled about management enough to write about it. Christian T. Peterson was CEO of FFG all the way until 2018, so through all of FFG's prime, and this guy is a game designer who decided to run the company. And when watching the Sus D documentary on Twilight Imperium, he's also head of publishing and makes the final calls on Twilight Imperium, which is his brainchild.
Christian, be the owner and creator of the IP, presents its own challenges, and it makes some things easier.
Yeah, I mean, that is part of the problem with working on some of Chris's galaxies, because he has strong opinions about them, and yet I'm not in it. I don't live in Chris's head, and Chris doesn't have a lot of time to meet with me or to write it all down. And so, oops, what do we do?
Well, let's make something up, and we'll put something in there that maybe doesn't fit into the universe, but we have no idea if it fits in because we haven't asked the right question.
There are people who feel the same way about me as that I felt about Chris. So, yeah, it's challenging. It's challenging.
So yeah, it's easy to see how one guy was doing so many tasks, and if perhaps you didn't share that crazy zealotry and worked as many hours as the in-group, you were not treated well. Kind of like a fraternity perhaps, or a video game company. Basically, mad geniuses are probably not good managers. And so if you look at many companies, they have someone that runs the day-to-day, and then that person is helping keep the creative in check. And remember how we talked about Games Workshop leaving? So let's talk about IPs, or intellectual property. FFG's IP holdings just weren't doing as well over time. So they had Game of Thrones before it was even a TV show, so great pick there. But after the TV show hit season 7, it just lost all pop culture credibility. Or how FFG had Star Wars, which was always going to be cool, but maybe it wasn't as compelling to buy Star Wars content from the new movies and TV shows when they weren't that well received. Like, think of the Star Wars Rebellion expansion that featured a lot of Disney movie stuff. And where did the Legend of the Five Rings IP go? They were so on top of announcing role-playing stuff. Was there ever going to be multiple board games for this? Anyways, I'm not going to get into the nitty-gritty of it. Currently, FFG has one board game with a board it has upcoming releases for, Twilight Imperium 4. Then it has a bunch of LCG packs and expansions, which are just for long-running LCGs. The only true new game FFG has made in recent time is Star Wars Unlimited in 2024, last year. This wasn't a jaw-dropping game design by any means. I mean, check out our line from our review here. It feels kind of standard. I mean, you're tapping resources to play units, combat is extremely similar to Hearthstone, basically everything that's been done before. Star Wars Unlimited doesn't feel like a flashy invention, but an innovation that steals, copies, mimics, etc. so many other TCGs. I mean, today FFG would try to sign F1, The Expanse, Stranger Things, The Last of Us, or Shogun. Of course, I don't know how feasible these are to sign, but you get the idea. Also, I'm not sure if the loss of the cool IPs is more of a symptom of them playing safe rather than a cause of FFG's decline. Another angle of the decline is that the fans just got smarter and or tired of FFG sales tactics. So remember how we mentioned that FFG was very expansion heavy? So they would release a ton of expansions for their successful games like Arkham Horror or Eldritch Horror. So people would buy a lot of these expansions, and then at some point, if the game was so successful and FFG couldn't release any more expansions, they would actually stop supporting it and then leverage the IP or systems again to create a more streamlined version of the game. This essentially voided all of your previous expansion buy-ins, so you had to start from nothing again. So then people got mad from years of attachment to the current system and didn't want to buy into more expansions. This feeling probably happened for Arkham Horror to Eldritch Horror, to Arkham Horror 3rd Edition, to Arkham Horror LCG, then there's Lord of the Rings LCG to Arkham Horror LCG. Or the big one is Descent 2nd Edition, which had so many expansions for one day, it just lost all support from FFG as FFG gambled on Descent Legends. So part of Descent Legends' irrelevance for it being such a huge name with Descent, this irrelevance may just be because past Descent fans never bought into it. It was super expensive, demanded app usage, and obsoleted all of your previous edition's components. Though FFG listened for Mansions of Madness 2nd Edition, letting you incorporate many components from 1st Edition into 2nd, it was probably too late, and Mansions of Madness was never nearly as popular as Descent. In fact, I wanted to bring up FFG's expansion reliance as being a two-edged sword, as you see that people don't want to let go of previous game lines they've dumped so much money into. So we've noted that expansions are great at boosting sales and extending life cycles of beloved games. However, expansion sales also meant that FFG didn't have a huge incentive to get the base game right. So their playtesting was never under heavy scrutiny to improve as it should have been. Then as the industry matured with more reviewers coming into the scene, people paid attention to these reviewers, and so if a game got bad reviews on release, they might just not be bought, so the game doesn't take off. Again, the industry changed and people learned. Some FFG woes I want to sneak in there, but don't matter too much, is that the games never came with an insert, so that was exhausting to always have to buy your own storage thing. Or there's this reputation that FFG rulebooks are just awful. Now, I've seen some pretty good ones from them, but also some pretty awful ones like Star Wars Rebellion. That's because this learn to play is not very well organized, with the additional rules needed to play the game, like loyalty for planets or combat, are located in the back of this rulebook. So over here we have TI4's rules, which are great, but this is TI4. It's the 4th edition. So I haven't read 1st edition or 2nd editions, but maybe the joke is that they needed 4 editions to get it right. I don't know. Crowdfunding. This is even more speculation on FFG's decline, but this one could be a big one. So let's go through some board game history. Before Kickstarter's advent in 2009, if you wanted to publish your board game, you didn't have many options. You basically either go to an established company and sell them the rights, then they could probably make a bunch of changes that you might not like, and then they would also take more of a cut. Or you could self-publish and flounder without the connections and resources, and if the game didn't sell well, you're super screwed and had a bunch of cardboard sitting around. But Kickstarter kinda still sounded like a scam at first. I mean, the consumer is paying money before the games or even rules were completed. I, for one, was too scared to kickstart anything for years. Yet, just like online retail, it caught on. Kickstarter was made in 2009, but really started getting big for board games around, I think, 2012. I mean, that's when Zombicide Black Plague caught my eye after all, of raising over $2 million, which was mind-blowing. So now, you could get a big minis box for a good price, with a bunch of freebies and add-ons for even better prices, as long as you were okay with waiting for it, and it looks like people were totally okay with paying and waiting. For FFG, this probably meant that some of their big box customers went, hey, well, I can get what I want for cheaper on Kickstarter, and it will have so much content with stretch goals and design promises and hype, and so I don't need to worry about FFG expansions. This brings us to what used to be the #1 BGG board game, Gloomhaven, which is a campaign dungeon crawler, which perfectly bites into the FFG market of all their campaign dungeon crawler games. I mean, I've talked to people and read forums about how many people went straight from Descent 2nd Edition to Gloomhaven, so there goes a lot of those customers. The rise of Kickstarter to self-publish also meant that there's tons of young designers who, instead of going to work for FFG, they just go work for themselves and have all the creative freedom and financial upside. No longer FFG was a place that you demanded to work at to jumpstart your board game design career. You could do it all from home and didn't have to move to Minnesota, which, let's face it, is really cold. FFG never did crowdfunding. Never. They never caught on. When Hasbro and Cool Mini or Not were doing some form of it, FFG decided to stick to their guns and go always straight to retail. Well, hats off to them for letting their fans not have to deal with crowdfunding schlop or drama, but this also meant that FFG was taking on a lot of risk for all their projects, which we'll get back to. The rise of Wizards of the Coast. FFG's decline actually correlated with Wizards of the Coast gaining popularity with D&D, so FFG wasn't able to make money off of the role-playing line as much anymore. MTG also had a massive resurgence, with it earning over $1 billion in revenue in 2021, which was its best year ever. But its growth along the decades was taking away from FFG's LCG hopes, as it looks like people just went back to the good old TCGs. Actually, we are currently in a new age of TCGs, where crowdfunding has made more TCGs that wouldn't otherwise exist, like Grand Archive, which some of my friends play constantly and it's doing fantastic nowadays. And so this brings us to... So why did TCGs end up being more popular than LCGs? Aren't LCGs just better? They're cheaper, right? You get all the cards. Wait, why are all of FFG's competitive LCGs dead? One big dirty truth is that LCGs suck at building communities. So because you can just get every single card from a box, there's very minimal trading that happens. So no trade binders and people hanging out to trade, which in turn means less people hanging around a card shop. Like you could imagine just going to a card shop to seeing if someone wants to trade, and then you got hungry so you bought something to eat there. Or maybe you just felt like trying your luck with a new pack or packs that's also money for the store. So then the store has reason to support the game. Also, card stores don't have any incentive to host events for LCGs because people playing don't care about getting more cards as rewards because they already have all the cards. The little gambling shtick of booster packs actually works. Because a sealed pack is a pseudo-currency for the game that everyone values, and it allows games like Magic the Gathering to have a sealed format where you can open boosters and create decks off of that. Like think of Friday Night Magic and pre-sealed and how that's so important to card stores and MTG. So LCGs are actually losing out on the community end of things, and people play card games to be social, and even if you're just hanging out not talking and drafting cards, you're still being social. Also, LCGs having guaranteed cards doesn't mean that the game is cheaper, and sometimes you need a third copy of a card and you only get 2 in the box. Well, you're gonna have to buy the entire box again. That sucks. For someone trying to play a card game for the first time to see if they like it, it's actually just a far lower barrier to entry to just buy a couple packs and go from there. Or even dual decks can be cheaper and easier to learn than an entire base set box, even though the base set is technically more content value. Essentially, LCGs did a good job of catering to the board game market with the mentality of first you buy your base game, then you buy the expansions to put on top of your base game. And this might be a good reason why cooperative LCGs, like this, are still kicking around because they're just inherently a lot more noob friendly. What FFG targeted with their competitive LCGs is the most hardcore of players. They're players that could keep up with every single set so they could participate in the highest level of play. Like this could work if your game is that good, like Android Netrunner. But it also probably isn't healthy for your community long term. Like think about Yu-Gi-Oh! Or Magic, where they would have extra fun sets to hook in noobs, like flashy dual decks of supplementary sets. FFG didn't do that. There's also some fumbling I think FFG did that isn't the LCG's nature's fault, where they just had too many LCGs at some point, where they were competing with themselves. At some point there were 5 to 6 going on at the same time. This probably hurt the internal direction on which LCG they should focus on, and as a fan, well, which FFG LCG should I invest into? Like think about Wizards of the Coast, which is way bigger than FFG, and they had one game, one MTG to focus on. And maybe they were just desperate for money, but FFG was releasing some of the sets just way too quickly. Like I remember Netrunner was having monthly releases at some point, which meant that you barely had time to adjust for a card pool, for a game that took longer than normal TCGs to play. Like MTG standard legal sets came out once every 3 months. So if you're sick of TCGs of having to constantly keep up, I could see how you could equally be disgruntled with LCGs. It's like the same money pit, just wearing different clothes. The final nail in the coffin for competitive LCGs seems to be FFG's stance on the recent Star Wars Unlimited, which is going back to booster packs. And what do you know? You can do house drafts with that, and I'm sure that's making FFG a lot of money. So the billion-dollar question that FFG just couldn't quite crack is, what's next after LCGs? Does anyone know? Let me know. In 2014, Asmodee bought FFG, but in 2017, 3 years later, FFG came out with TI4. So clearly the Asmodee buyout wasn't that bad, at least at first. But first let's talk about why. Why sell to Asmodee? Well, I did some snooping on a fantastic lengthy Peterson interview, and he said that he just wanted to pay back his initial investors, including his parents. This I can totally understand, and he might have just wanted to relax after about 25 years of insane work. Then he gets to be CEO of Asmodee North America for a bit. That's a pretty nice title. So he made Twilight Imperium 3 years later. Then at the end of 2018, 1 year later, Peterson moved on. Okay, but what is Asmodee, right? So they're a conglomerate that owns a bunch of smaller publishers. They are essentially just managing a bunch of games in their portfolio, which include Catan, Ticket to Ride, Pandemic, Arkham Horror, Star Wars X-Wing, and Splendor. So it's really easy to just say, oh, Asmodee, oh, for FFG's faults, but we really have to look at these conditions that led to FFG selling to Asmodee in the first place. And of course, as I said before, there were so many reasons why FFG might have been struggling. And under Asmodee, at least at first, FFG still came out with some banger games. There was Star Wars Rebellion, there was Forbidden Stars, there was Mansions of Madness 2nd Edition. It's just really that when Peterson left in 2018, the creative spark fizzled out. Because eventually the rest of the band left. Corey Kay made Unexpected Games in 2019, Kevin Wilson made Incredible Dream Studios as mostly the project lead, and Nikki Valens, who was instrumental in many games like Mansions of Madness, they went to go do freelance work like for Cephalo Affairs, Buttons and Bugs. Actually, the Earthborn Rangers team is headed by so many ex-FFG employees, you could just go there if you wanted FFG stuff. But yeah, Asmodee certainly seemed to reduce the insane risk that FFG was taking on, like pretty much only focusing on big IPs like Arkham Horror and Marvel. And Asmodee even moved a bunch of FFG's role-playing to another company called Edge, because they can just do that. It's funny to look at Twilight Inscription though. That was definitely a very safe, corporate feeling board game for Twilight Imperium. It wasn't made for people that actually played Twilight Imperium. It was made for people that looked at space games and went, oh, roll and write, right? That could be cool. Anyways, I've heard it somewhere that small studios treat all their lines like children, and they love them all equally. And that's like FFG's early days, where they're supporting so many products, profitable or not. Asmodee is actually owned by someone else. It's owned by Eurazeo in 2014, and Asmodee is now owned by PAI, who bought them in 2018. So FFG is further distanced from the original owners now. So it's probably best to think of FFG's decision making now as from an investment firm that just happens to print board games. And so they have no hesitation to just cut some out. FFG is probably more profitable and a healthier workplace to work at now, but they don't really have that it factor anymore that created so many beloved titles for people. Final thoughts, FFG is far from dead, but they're also far from what they used to be. And with this new TI4 expansion that just got announced, I felt this feeling again, this twinge of excitement that I used to feel very commonly when going through the FFG website. And so far, playing the Codex and some of the Prince of Play stuff from the new TI4 expansion, yeah, I'm kind of okay with this reality. I'm still having fun. Looking back, the board game industry is just very different now than it was 30 years ago when FFG was founded. For a comparison, when Twilight Imperium was released, there was another Euro game that used a hex system that had trading sheep and wood. Yep, it was called The Settlers of Catan. Fast forward to today, and there's the 4th version of Twilight Imperium with 2 expansions. In fact, so much stuff that if Peterson was still working on FFG, he would likely say, no, there needs to be one definitive box so newcomers can start playing. So, TI5? What actually stuck out to me a lot on the Susty Twilight Imperium vid is that the cover artist literally said,
We're always going to be making Twilight Imperium.
And yeah, they still are pumping out Twilight Imperium. Though, if you think about it, FFG's core was lots of TTRPGs, and then Asmodee moved them all away now. What are some present-day companies I've seen take on the mantle of FFG? Well, it's gotta be Awaken Realms. They have fully embraced crowdfunding. In fact, they use it for all their projects, and they seem to be doing very well. They also have these thematic big box games. They have pure co-op, multiple campaign games, and of course this present-day BSG-esque in Nemesis. Other games that feel FFG that aren't Awaken Realms are Cthulhu Death May Die and Human Punishment: The Beginning. As for a person who is like Christian T. Peterson today, that would definitely be Gloomhaven's Isaac Childress, who created a beloved company off of one big box game, so Peterson had his Twilight Imperium and Childress had his Gloomhaven. Now Gloomhaven has its own IP with role-playing games for the burgeoning Cephalofair game. The question I have for everyone is, do you think FFG would still be around if not for Asmodee? Do we live in the best timeline for it, of still getting support for Twilight Imperium, Arkham Horror, and Star Wars Unlimited, even though the hype releases like Mansions of Madness or Android Netrunner are no longer? Things are just different now. I read a quote by Kevin Wilson in an interview that he said that more games are coming out today during Gen Con than they used to come out in an entire year. It almost feels like FFG is a semi-retired gunslinger of the Wild West that was board game design, and the landscape is more tamed, and now this gunslinger has mostly hung up its pistols, and a lot of the parts that made him special have left, but every once in a while, he'll show you that he can still fight. Thank you to our patrons for making videos like this possible. This one took a long time to research. It's definitely a bit different for us. I'd like to hear what you have to say about more ideas for a structure like this. Always trying to do new stuff. Okay, all right. Thank you to our Mad Lads of Cardboard over here too. Yep, that's it. Like, comment, subscribe. We have our Patreon and coffee if you want to help. Bye-bye.